The marble halls of Babylon gleamed with a brilliance that could blind the eye. Gold reflected in pools of water beneath lush gardens, while towering columns carved with intricate reliefs seemed to reach toward the heavens. From the outside, the palace was a symbol of perfection, a city within a city, where every corner celebrated wealth, artistry, and divine favor. Yet beneath this shimmering veneer, a far darker world existed, hidden behind doors no commoner could enter. Every corridor, every ceremonial chamber, every private chamber of the king whispered secrets that could unravel kingdoms. It was a place where loyalty was fragile, where even the closest confidants could become instruments of murder, and where the line between love and betrayal was perilously thin. Within these walls, whispers carried as much power as proclamations from the throne. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, exchanging rumors of plots, secret alliances, and the subtle manipulations that could shift the balance of power. Trust was a dangerous illusion. One misplaced word could trigger exile, imprisonment, or a far more permanent end. To live within the palace was to walk a knife's edge. The grandeur of feasts and celebrations masked an undercurrent of fear, where even a smile could conceal a dagger poised to strike. Each luxurious garment, each perfumed touch, might hide a motive as lethal as any sword. The kings of Babylon, divine in their own eyes, cultivated this environment of tension. They were deities among men, but their very power made them targets for jealousy, ambition, and resentment. Advisors who once whispered wisdom in the king's ear could overnight become traitors, manipulated by fear, envy, or the promise of favor elsewhere. Princes, bound by blood and oath, plotted to seize the throne, sometimes with cunning subtlety, other times with brutal violence. Family, often the only supposed sanctuary, became the first arena of betrayal. The palace was not merely a residence, it was a battlefield where every gesture, every glance, carried hidden meaning, and every alliance was both a shield and a potential weapon. This danger extended beyond politics into the intimate spaces of the royal household. Queens and concubines, masters of both beauty and deception, maneuvered with calculated precision. Behind their silken curtains, secrets were exchanged, alliances forged, and enemies marked for destruction. A seemingly gentle hand could administer the most cruel of fates, while a whispered word could ignite a chain of events leading to death and despair. The palace became a theater of psychology, where manipulation was an art and betrayal the ultimate performance. Observing these interactions, one could feel the pulse of a city suspended between awe and horror. Yet the terror of the palace was not always immediate or visible. Sometimes it arrived disguised in the form of hospitality or ceremony, slowly poisoning trust and friendship. Sometimes it manifested in sudden violence, a dagger at a banquet, or a mysterious illness that claimed the life of an unsuspecting official. The inhabitants of the palace learned early to read between the lines, to discern hidden motives in laughter, to detect threats in flattery. Survival depended on vigilance, cunning, and the ability to mask one's own ambitions while observing those of others. The palace was a labyrinth of intrigue, and every corner could conceal both opportunity and death. By the time the sun set over the hanging gardens, casting shadows over the golden walls, the duality of Babylon became clear. Beauty and terror coexisted in a delicate, terrifying balance. The very features that inspired admiration, the grand halls, the shimmering waters, the intricate art, were also the backdrop for some of the most sinister human behavior imaginable. Here, ambition, envy, love, and fear intertwined, creating a psychological landscape as treacherous as the political one. The grandeur of Babylon's palaces was inseparable from the treacheries that unfolded within, a city where every act of loyalty could mask betrayal, and every gesture of power contained the potential for death. In this world, nothing was as it seemed, and the whispers in the marble halls foretold horrors that would leave even the bravest trembling with unease. The kings of Babylon were more than rulers. In their minds, they were gods walking among men. To wield such absolute power was to inhabit a world where fear, ambition, and superstition intertwined, shaping both their decisions and the lives of those around them. Nebuchadnezzar, too, the most famous of these god kings, was revered for his architectural marvels and military conquests, yet his grandeur concealed a mind perpetually shadowed by paranoia and the ever-present threat of betrayal. Every advisor, every general, every family member was not just a servant or kin, they were potential usurpers, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In Babylon, the throne was not merely a seat of honor, it was a throne of suspicion, a gilded trap that demanded both reverence and ruthless vigilance. Paranoia was a constant companion for these rulers. The very act of trusting someone could invite disaster. Historical records hint at sudden imprisonments, mysterious disappearances, and unexplained deaths within the royal court. Ministers who once shaped policy alongside the king could vanish overnight, leaving only whispers of their fates behind. The palace was a psychological battlefield where loyalty was always tested, and obedience was only as valuable as one's ability to anticipate the king's fears. Even the most skilled courtiers understood that proximity to power brought both opportunity and danger, and one wrong gesture could transform an ally into a target. Every smile could conceal malice, every flattery could be a trap, and every word spoken in the hallways could alter the trajectory of lives. Family ties, often regarded as sacred bonds, were particularly fraught. Sons plotted against fathers, brothers betrayed brothers, and queens sometimes conspired against kings they ostensibly served. These betrayals were rarely impulsive, they were meticulously planned, calculated with an understanding of timing, psychology, and the perception of the palace populace. Even the simple act of succession was enough to ignite a deadly chain reaction. The king's favoritism could provoke envy, the smallest sign of weakness could invite conspiracy, and an unguarded moment could result in assassination. Blood was supposed to guarantee trust, yet in Babylon, it frequently guaranteed the opposite. The family palace became a theater of moral ambiguity, where survival demanded the subjugation of loyalty to ambition. The divine status attributed to kings complicated matters further. Belief in their semi-divine nature meant that subjects feared not just the king's power, but also the consequences of offending a man who was considered closer to the gods than ordinary men. This sanctity amplified betrayal's danger. To plot against a king was not only treason but sacrilege. Advisors and generals operated under constant pressure, forced to navigate a treacherous web of commands and expectations. Any misstep, real or perceived, could lead to swift retribution. Yet this fear also fed the king's own insecurities. In a court where betrayal was inevitable, rulers developed habits of extreme caution, isolating themselves from even their most trusted allies. The palace walls that should have protected them became a prison, and power itself became a source of constant psychological torment. Power was intoxicating, but it also demanded ruthless pragmatism. Kings often orchestrated public displays of authority, executions, military parades, or lavish festivals, to remind both the populace and their inner circle of the consequences of dissent. Yet behind the spectacle, the real struggles were quieter, more insidious. Courtiers competed to gain influence, using flattery, espionage, or subtle manipulation to undermine rivals. Decisions that appeared benevolent were sometimes strategies to root out disloyalty. Even acts of apparent generosity could serve as tests, observing who would show gratitude, who would resent, and who might secretly conspire. The court was a complex organism, where psychology, politics, and fear interwove to create a delicate equilibrium, one that could collapse violently at any moment. The palace was also a reflection of human nature in extremis. The absolute concentration of power revealed the darkest corners of ambition, envy, and desire. The king's paranoia forced everyone around him to become observers, analysts, and actors, constantly calculating, performing, and anticipating. This created a cycle where betrayal was both a survival tactic and a natural consequence of the environment. Individuals were not inherently evil, yet the pressures of proximity to power often transformed them into instruments of intrigue. The psychological tension in the palace was relentless. Courtiers balanced loyalty against self-preservation, ambition against fear, and love against the ever-present shadow of death. Babylon was not merely a city, it was a crucible of human psychology, amplifying virtues and vices alike, producing acts of cunning and cruelty that would echo through history. Even in moments of ceremony or divine worship, the weight of paranoia lingered. While the king appeared majestic before gods and subjects, every interaction was an opportunity for assessment. Advisors' expressions, gestures, and timing were scrutinized. Every conversation was double-edged, every compliment potentially insincere. To navigate the palace successfully required a mastery of perception, the ability to read hidden motives as accurately as a general interprets the movements of an army. A misplaced word, an untimely sigh, or a hesitation could mark someone for exile or worse. Loyalty was a performance, and betrayal was both a sword and a shield. By understanding the psychology of Babylonian kings, one begins to see why betrayal was not merely a possibility, it was an inevitability. The concentration of power, combined with divine pretension, family rivalry, and courtly intrigue, created a perfect storm where suspicion was constant and treachery was woven into the fabric of daily life. In this environment, no gesture could be taken at face value, no relationship could be wholly trusted, and the line between friend and enemy blurred constantly. The kings themselves, though seemingly omnipotent, were trapped by their own fear, compelled to act with both force and caution, navigating a palace alive with hidden threats. In Babylon, power was intoxicating yet perilous, divine yet dangerous, magnificent yet merciless. The women of Babylon's palace moved through its halls like shadows of silk and perfume, their beauty both mesmerizing and dangerous. Queens and concubines were often portrayed as ornaments in historical accounts, their value measured in charm, elegance, or fertility. Yet behind their graceful appearances lay minds trained in calculation, manipulation, and survival. In the intimate world of the royal harem, power took on subtler, more insidious forms. While kings wielded swords and decrees, these women wielded influence through whispers, secret messages, and carefully cultivated alliances. They understood that within the palace, survival and supremacy often depended on intelligence and cunning rather than physical force, and betrayal could be as effective as any weapon. Silken robes concealed daggers of ambition. Many of these women were trained from youth in the arts of persuasion and psychological warfare. A gentle touch or a comforting smile could mask lethal intentions. A compliment could be the first step in undermining a rival's confidence. The queen's influence over the king was not only emotional but strategic. She could sway decisions, manipulate succession, or isolate enemies. Stories suggest that some queens orchestrated poisonings with meticulous care, administering subtle toxins that mimicked natural illness, ensuring their targets vanished without raising suspicion. Even a single cup of wine could change the fate of the kingdom, demonstrating that in Babylon, betrayal was often invisible yet absolute. Alliances formed within the harem were as intricate as any battlefield strategy. Women cultivated friendships that might turn lethal at the first sign of advantage. The bonds of sisterhood or shared quarters were temporary. Loyalty was measured against opportunity. The palace, luxurious as it seemed, was a laboratory of human ambition, where social cues, gestures, and whispered words carried immense consequences. Even those considered friends had to be approached with caution. A subtle glance could reveal jealousy, a tone of voice could betray hidden fear, and small victories could ignite deadly rivalries. In this world, intelligence was survival, and betrayal was often the currency of power. The manipulation of heirs added another layer of complexity. Queens and concubines understood that the throne itself was the ultimate prize. By influencing princes, they could ensure the king's favor, secure the succession of a preferred child, or eliminate threats from rivals. Some historical accounts describe plots where young heirs were subtly undermined, steered into making poor decisions, or even eliminated under the guise of accidents or disease. Mothers and advisors became the unseen architects of power, shaping the future of the empire without ever holding the scepter themselves. Their influence, though invisible to the public eye, often determined who would ascend the throne and who would vanish into obscurity or death. But manipulation was not always purely strategic. It was also deeply psychological. The queen could exploit jealousy, fear, and desire to control those around her. She might provoke rivalry between concubines, turning ambition against itself. She could cultivate the king's dependence, subtly eroding his trust in others while ensuring his reliance on her counsel. The psychological sophistication required was immense. Even the slightest error could provoke suspicion, leading to exile or execution. The palace became a stage for subtle power struggles, where intelligence, patience, and timing mattered more than brute force, and where betrayal was a daily, inevitable art. The duality of these women's lives was stark. Publicly, they embodied grace, beauty, and loyalty, performing the roles expected by courtly decorum. Privately, they engaged in a world of lethal politics, where secrets were the most valuable commodities. Their elegance concealed ruthlessness, their charm masked ambition. In many ways, the women of Babylon's palace were mirrors of the society around them, a civilization of grandeur intertwined with violence, of divinity intertwined with mortality, of trust entangled with treachery. Their stories reveal a paradox, that the greatest power could lie not in the hands that held the sword, but in those that whispered, persuaded, and plotted in the shadows. Beyond personal ambition, there was also survival. The palace was a hazardous environment, and every woman had to navigate threats from rivals, jealous concubines, and even the king himself. Missteps could lead to exile, imprisonment, or death. The stakes were always life or death, and the tools of influence were subtlety, charm, and psychological insight. Historical accounts hint at women who feigned loyalty while secretly orchestrating the downfall of those who threatened them, creating a culture in which trust was a strategic gamble. Their intelligence, courage, and cunning were as vital as any weapon, allowing them not just to survive, but to thrive amidst danger. Some queens elevated betrayal to artistry. By manipulating multiple factions simultaneously, they could control the flow of information, ensuring rivals fell prey to their own overconfidence or miscalculations. Others used psychological manipulation to isolate enemies, turning the king against those who might have been loyal, or convincing rivals to eliminate each other. The palace, under their influence, became a chessboard, with every person a piece whose movements were anticipated and exploited. Success required foresight, patience, and a ruthless understanding of human psychology. In this environment, a single miscalculated word could shift the balance of power and determine the fate of entire families. The consequences of failure were severe, yet the rewards were immense. Women who mastered these subtle arts of betrayal could secure favor, wealth, and influence unparalleled in the empire. Their names might be remembered alongside kings and chronicles, not for military conquest, but for the invisible power they wielded within the palace walls. In this way, Babylon's queens and concubines challenged modern notions of power. They proved that elegance and intellect, charm and cunning, could alter the course of history, often more effectively than armies or laws. The palace was not only a center of political intrigue, it was a theater of psychological mastery, and the women who thrived there were among its most formidable actors. Ultimately, the story of the Queen's Web is a story of contrast, beauty and brutality, desire and danger, trust and treachery. These women navigated a world where appearances were deceptive, where ambition could hide behind a smile, and where survival demanded constant vigilance. Through their cunning and intelligence, they shaped the fate of kings, princes, and entire dynasties. In their hands, betrayal was not mere crime. It was a form of artistry, a delicate, dangerous dance that could determine the survival of empires. In Babylon, power and peril were inseparable, and the queens who mastered both left a legacy as enduring as the walls of the palace itself. The Palace of Babylon was a place where family ties were both sacred and deadly. Blood, which elsewhere might symbolize trust and loyalty, within these walls often became the very instrument of betrayal. Brothers vied for power, sons coveted thrones, and even fathers could become victims of their children's ambition. Royal bloodlines, meant to preserve continuity and divine favor, instead fueled suspicion, jealousy, and lethal competition. The throne, a symbol of ultimate authority, was never secure, not even from those who shared the same lineage. Within the gilded walls, loyalty was a fragile illusion, and family gatherings could conceal whispered conspiracies, plotting, and silent threats. the dynamics between siblings were especially perilous. Historical accounts reveal instances where brothers, bound by the same father and upbringing, plotted against one another in pursuit of power. These were not impulsive acts of malice but carefully calculated schemes, taking advantage of timing, alliances, and the perception of the palace court. A brother might feign loyalty while secretly undermining his sibling's position, spreading rumors, or influencing key advisors. Every gesture, from a bow to a glance, could be loaded with hidden intent. The palace, with its wealth and splendor, became an arena of psychological warfare, where each royal child learned early that kinship could mask mortal danger. The relationship between father and son was equally fraught. Sons were expected to inherit, to honor their fathers, yet they were also pressured by ambition and opportunity. Some princes, impatient or mistrustful, resorted to plotting their father's downfall, often using subtlety rather than open rebellion. Poison, manipulation of advisors, or instigating military challenges could serve as tools to advance their claims. At times, a father's suspicion of a son's ambition could provoke preemptive strikes, creating a vicious cycle of fear and counter-betrayal. The palace, intended as a place of familial continuity, often transformed into a crucible of tension and mortality. Queens and concubines played critical roles in these familial betrayals. Mothers sometimes guided sons toward acts of ambition, encouraging subtle sabotage or sowing distrust among rivals. Their influence could be decisive, determining which children would ascend the throne and which would be left in obscurity or removed entirely. In some cases, maternal manipulation was coupled with strategic alliances among palace women, orchestrating situations where one brother's ambitions would inadvertently lead to his own ruin. Through such machinations, the seemingly domestic world of family life became intertwined with the deadly politics of the court, revealing the palace as a place where private and political agendas were inseparable. The pressure of succession created an environment in which betrayal became normalized. Sons were not merely heirs but competitors, each striving to prove themselves capable of ruling. Mistakes, hesitation, or indecision could be exploited, leading to exile, imprisonment, or death. The stakes were never theoretical, every choice could mean survival or annihilation. Within this climate, psychological acuity was as essential as courage. Royal children learned to interpret gestures, decipher conversations, and anticipate the moves of both allies and rivals. The palace became a living chessboard, where strategy, foresight, and manipulation determined not only who would reign, but who would endure at all. Trust was a commodity as rare as gold. Even siblings who outwardly appeared united could secretly plot each other's downfall. Rivalry was often cloaked in affection, advice was laced with subtle threats, and loyalty was conditional upon circumstance and advantage. Every banquet, ceremony, and council meeting became a stage for negotiation, observation, and testing. A misstep could unravel the careful balance of alliances, revealing ambitions that had been carefully concealed. The palace, resplendent in its beauty, was also a minefield of deception, and survival required constant vigilance, sharp perception, and the ability to anticipate human ambition in its most dangerous forms. The psychological toll of this environment was immense. Royal children grew up understanding that love and fear were intertwined, that affection could mask threat, and that power was inseparable from danger. They learned to suppress impulse, to mask emotion, and to cultivate patience, waiting for the precise moment when action could yield maximum advantage. Even those who acted honorably were forced to navigate a treacherous maze, balancing moral integrity against the brutal realities of palace life. Betrayal was not a failure of character. In many cases, it was a rational response to an environment that rewarded cunning and punished naivety. Historical records, though sparse, hint at dramatic and tragic outcomes of familial treachery. Some princes vanished mysteriously, their deaths quietly erased from official accounts, while others were executed in sudden displays of authority meant to deter rivals. Brothers who had shared beds, meals, and tutors could become sworn enemies overnight. Fathers, unable to discern loyalty from deception, sometimes sanctioned the elimination of their own children, mistaking ambition for treachery or acting preemptively to secure the throne. These events created an atmosphere of perpetual tension, where the private world of family life collided violently with the public sphere of power. Yet even amidst these dangers, the bonds of blood were not entirely broken. Alliances within families could be formidable, allowing for moments of genuine trust and shared purpose. But such alliances were fragile, constantly threatened by ambition, envy, and circumstance. The palace required an almost unnatural level of psychological acuity, where affection was balanced with suspicion and cooperation existed alongside deadly competition. Those who survived this environment became masters of human behavior, able to read the intentions and desires of those around them with remarkable precision. In Babylon, the palace was more than a seat of political power. It was a crucible where human relationships were tested to their limits. Blood, instead of guaranteeing safety or loyalty, often became the instrument of ambition and fear. Siblings turned against one another, sons challenged fathers, and alliances shifted with subtle gestures and whispered words. The interplay of love, rivalry, and survival created a psychological landscape as dangerous as any battlefield. Within these walls, family was not merely kinship, it was strategy, risk, and occasionally, a prelude to death. The throne demanded loyalty, but survival demanded cunning, leaving the royal family in a constant state of tension, where betrayal was never far from the surface, and the bonds of blood were simultaneously strongest and most perilous. Within the gilded walls of Babylon's palace, death often arrived in the most unassuming forms. Among the most insidious instruments of betrayal were the poisoners and secret artisans who operated in the shadows, invisible yet indispensable to the machinery of power. These individuals were masters of subtlety, skilled in turning ordinary objects, meals, and potions into vectors of lethal intent. Their craft was not simply technical. It required an intimate understanding of human psychology, timing, and perception. A single misstep could expose them to the wrath of the king or the vengeance of a rival, yet a perfectly executed act of treachery could shift the balance of power in ways armies could not. The preparation of poisons was a meticulous art. Substances were extracted from plants, minerals, and even exotic imports brought from distant lands, each chosen for its ability to mimic natural disease or sudden misfortune. Some poisons acted slowly, eroding strength and will over days, creating the illusion of illness or divine punishment. Others acted swiftly, ensuring that death occurred before suspicion could arise. Mastery required precision. A drop too much or too little could reveal the act or fail to deliver it. For those who wielded these toxins, their laboratory was not a mere workshop. It was a theater where intellect, patience, and cold calculation intersected with mortality. These poisoners were not limited to direct contact with their targets. Often, they operated through intermediaries, using seemingly innocent servants, food tasters, or attendants to deliver their work. They understood the importance of perception. The king or a rival must never suspect, and the palace must continue to function without disruption. In many ways, their artistry was psychological as much as chemical, relying on the manipulation of human expectation, trust, and attention. By exploiting routines, social rituals, and ceremonial practices, they ensured that death became a quiet, almost natural event, leaving those left behind to puzzle over sudden misfortune while the perpetrator remained unseen. The palace itself facilitated this invisible warfare. Its layers of courtiers, attendants, and servants created a network through which information and substances could move unnoticed. In such a controlled environment, even the most careful observer could miss the signs of subtle plotting. A seemingly ordinary cup of wine, a carefully prepared meal, or an innocuous gift could carry the weight of death. The artistry lay in making these acts appear natural, incidental, or divinely ordained. It was a form of psychological mastery that required foresight, patience, and a deep understanding of human behavior, an invisible battle conducted in parallel with the overt struggles for power. The consequences of poisoning extended far beyond the immediate act. A single successful elimination could destabilize alliances, shift loyalties, and incite fear throughout the palace. Individuals became hypervigilant, constantly monitoring interactions, scrutinizing gifts, and questioning the sincerity of flattery. Suspicion became omnipresent, infecting both intimate relationships and broader political strategies. The threat of invisible death created a climate in which paranoia was rational and betrayal was expected. This invisible network of fear was as effective a weapon as any army, shaping decisions, behaviors, and allegiances throughout the palace. Poisoners often operated under the patronage of powerful figures, who used their services to secure their own survival or advance ambitions. Kings, queens, and ambitious courtiers alike relied on these hidden experts to eliminate rivals quietly and efficiently. Yet their role was perilous. Detection could lead to brutal punishment or execution. The risk of discovery amplified the skill required, as poisoners had to balance subtlety, timing, and secrecy against the deadly consequences of failure. Their work was as psychological as it was technical, a high-stakes game in which a single error could have fatal repercussions for themselves and their patrons. Beyond poisons, secret weapons and cunning devices were also integral to palace intrigue. Hidden blades, concealed mechanisms, and strategic architecture allowed assassins to act with precision and discretion. The king's chambers, ceremonial halls, and even private gardens could conceal traps designed to neutralize threats. These instruments were often combined with careful planning and intelligence gathering, transforming everyday spaces into zones of lethal potential. The psychological impact was profound. No place was entirely safe, and even routine activities, meals, walks, or meetings, carried hidden dangers. The palace itself became a character in the drama, shaping behavior, decision-making, and the very notion of trust. The artistry of these poisoners and hidden agents also extended to manipulation of perception and blame. Deaths could be staged to appear as accidents, illnesses, or divine punishment, preserving the secrecy of the act and the power of the patron. By exploiting superstition, ritual, and the limited knowledge of medicine, they ensured that even skilled observers were often deceived. This subtle orchestration of events heightened the psychological tension within the palace, reinforcing the sense that survival required constant vigilance, intelligence, and an acute understanding of human behavior. Those who failed to recognize these invisible threats were often their own undoing. Even more striking was the moral dimension of their work. Poisoners, though often seen as instruments, were active participants in shaping history. Each act of elimination, each carefully timed death, could alter the trajectory of dynasties, succession, and political alliances. They wielded a form of power that was both invisible and absolute, demonstrating that control did not always require armies or open confrontation. Their influence lay in their ability to operate unseen, transforming fear and suspicion into tangible instruments of survival and ambition. In many ways, they were the ultimate architects of the palace's shadowed world, their work blending science, psychology, and lethal artistry. Ultimately, the poisoners and secret artisans of Babylon reveal a chilling aspect of human ingenuity in the service of ambition. The palace, with all its beauty, ceremony, and divine symbolism, was simultaneously a laboratory of death. Life and loyalty were fragile, and the subtle hand of the poisoner could determine the fate of kings, heirs, and courtiers alike. These hidden experts turned ordinary objects into instruments of mortality, creating a pervasive climate of fear and suspicion that shaped every decision and interaction within the palace. In Babylon, betrayal was not always loud or violent. It was often invisible, meticulous, and profoundly effective, demonstrating that the deadliest power often lay in subtlety and secrecy rather than brute force. Through the mastery of poisons and invisible weapons, the Palace of Babylon became a realm where trust was a dangerous luxury, and every gesture could conceal lethal intent. Survival required not only intelligence and cunning but an awareness that even the most ordinary objects, meals, and routines could harbor death. In this world, betrayal was both art and necessity, and the poisoner was among the most powerful figures in a palace defined by intrigue, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of advantage. Their work reminds us that in the shadows of grandeur, the most effective acts of treachery are often those that remain unseen, leaving a legacy of fear, uncertainty, and ruthless ingenuity that echoes through the history of Babylon. The Palace of Babylon was a theater not only of beauty and ceremony but of constant psychological warfare. Beyond the glittering halls, fountains, and gardens, a hidden world thrived, a network of spies, informants, and covert agents whose loyalty was always provisional. These individuals were the unseen eyes and ears of the court, gathering intelligence, deciphering whispered conversations, and transmitting secrets to those who would use them to climb or survive. In such an environment, knowledge was power, and the most innocuous detail, a glance, a word, a hesitation, could carry consequences as deadly as any blade or poison. Survival depended on awareness, cunning, and the ability to predict human behavior with uncanny precision. The court was alive with subtle manipulations. Servants, eunuchs, and palace officials became conduits of influence, often moving unnoticed while observing the king, his family, and his inner circle. Information flowed through channels invisible to casual observers, allowing plots to form and dissolve before they were ever recognized. Some courtiers deliberately spread misinformation, setting traps for rivals while appearing loyal. Others acted as double agents, conveying truths selectively to balance favor, loyalty, and self-preservation. The palace operated like a vast web, each thread connecting actors whose motives were fluid and whose ambitions could shift in a single whispered word. This network of intrigue was both sophisticated and ruthless. Courtiers were expected to read nuance, detect deceit, and anticipate betrayals, all while maintaining the appearance of allegiance. Mistakes were costly. A servant who failed to notice a subtle signal could inadvertently allow a conspiracy to succeed, while a misinterpreted gesture could provoke suspicion and retribution. The stakes were never theoretical. Lives were lost, careers destroyed, and fortunes overturned. The palace, resplendent in its luxury, was simultaneously a labyrinth of vigilance, where observation, subtlety, and psychological acuity dictated survival. Spies and informants were often recruited from unlikely quarters. Eunuchs, considered neutral due to their unique social status, frequently acted as intermediaries in palace intrigue, passing information with discretion and skill. Servants, tasked with mundane duties, were trained to recognize patterns in behavior, detect inconsistencies, and report anomalies to their patrons. Even entertainers, musicians, dancers, and storytellers could serve as observers, blending performance with subtle surveillance. This covert network ensured that almost every action within the palace was monitored, creating a pervasive sense of uncertainty. Trust became a carefully measured commodity, and deception a tool wielded by nearly everyone. The psychological burden on those within the palace was immense. Every conversation, gesture, and expression could be interpreted as evidence of loyalty or betrayal. Courtiers learned to mask intentions behind smiles and politeness, to speak in layers of truth and falsehood, and to weigh every interaction with the king or his family. The line between sincerity and strategy blurred, and paranoia became a necessary survival skill. Even those who acted honorably were forced to engage in continuous observation, subtle calculation, and anticipatory maneuvering. The palace, outwardly a sanctuary of wealth and beauty, was in reality a crucible of suspicion and psychological tension. Ceremonial occasions, ostensibly displays of joy, religion, or loyalty, were often stages for observation and manipulation. Banquets, festivals, and religious rites provided opportunities to test the intentions of courtiers, gauge the loyalty of allies, and uncover hidden rivals. A misjudged reaction during a feast could reveal fear, arrogance, or disloyalty, providing others with leverage. Informants reported not only on explicit plots but also on attitudes, expressions, and behavior, creating a comprehensive psychological map of the court. Every detail, from the angle of a head to the tone of a laugh, could carry political weight, reinforcing the constant tension between appearance and reality. Rivalries and alliances within the palace were highly dynamic. A courtier could appear loyal one day, only to switch allegiance the next if circumstances favored betrayal. This fluidity created an environment in which strategic thinking, foresight, and adaptability were as critical as loyalty or courage. Political survival required anticipating not only the actions of the king but also the hidden ambitions of peers. Misreading intentions could have catastrophic consequences. The court functioned as a living chessboard, with players moving unseen, their strategies overlapping in complex, often deadly patterns. In this environment, manipulation of perception became a central skill. Information could be weaponized to create confusion, suspicion, or fear. Courtiers carefully controlled what was seen and heard, ensuring that rivals received only partial truths or misleading cues. False accusations, staged discoveries, and subtle provocations were common, forcing targets into defensive positions where a single misstep could destroy them. Psychological pressure became a form of coercion as potent as any physical threat. Survival demanded the ability to maintain composure under constant scrutiny, to interpret hidden signals accurately, and to project an image of loyalty while preparing for betrayal. Even the king himself relied on these networks, though often selectively and with caution. He had to balance trust with suspicion, employing spies to monitor the loyalty of ministers, family members, and advisors. Decisions were informed not only by observable behavior but also by the intelligence gathered from multiple, often conflicting sources. This created a cycle in which paranoia fueled the deployment of informants, and the informants' reports in turn reinforced the king's suspicion. The psychological tension extended through all levels of the palace, embedding distrust as both a survival mechanism and a tool of governance. Ultimately, the covert operations within the palace reveal the depth of psychological sophistication in Babylonian court life. Survival was not merely a matter of obedience or valor. It required intelligence, observation, and the ability to manipulate perception. Betrayal was not an anomaly but an ever-present factor in the social and political calculus of the court. Spies, informants, and secret observers shaped decisions, influenced relationships, and determined outcomes often more effectively than armies or decrees. The palace, with its grandeur and ceremonial brilliance, was simultaneously a psychological battlefield where knowledge, subtlety, and strategic deception dictated the flow of power. The culture of surveillance and intrigue transformed everyday life into a high-stakes game. Every smile could conceal a hidden agenda. Every gesture could carry a warning or a trap. Courtiers learned to navigate this environment with constant vigilance, employing wit, discretion, and intuition as tools of survival. In Babylon, the palace itself became a silent actor in the drama of ambition, an ever-present force that shaped behavior, decisions, and the very concept of loyalty. Those who thrived were not necessarily the strongest or the bravest, but those most adept at reading, manipulating, and responding to the complex human patterns that defined life behind the gilded walls. The result was a court where trust was always provisional, where appearances were carefully managed, and where betrayal could erupt in the most unexpected forms. The palace's elegance and beauty masked a complex web of observation, manipulation, and secret knowledge, revealing the psychological intricacies of power. Survival required mastery not only of social interaction but of human perception itself. In Babylon, the most powerful weapons were often invisible, the most potent threats imperceptible, and the most dangerous acts the ones that left no trace. The palace was a theater of subtlety, where the mind was both the battleground and the weapon, and where every player, knowingly or not, participated in a dance of deception as ancient as the walls themselves. Among the most chilling elements of Babylonian palace life was the constant presence of fear, a fear that stretched beyond the threats of betrayal or assassination and penetrated even the sacred spaces of worship and ceremony. The king's authority was considered divinely sanctioned, and the palace itself was a microcosm of the empire's spiritual and political hierarchy. Yet within this ostensibly ordered system, the gods themselves were often invoked to justify acts of cruelty, manipulation, and domination. Divine sanction could transform a simple political maneuver into an act of moral righteousness, giving the king and his agents a veneer of legitimacy even when committing unspeakable betrayals. Fear and faith intertwined, creating an environment in which obedience and terror were inseparable. Priests and temple officials played a particularly complex role in this dynamic. They were advisors, enforcers, and sometimes conspirators, wielding religious authority to influence courtly politics. Their interpretations of omens, rituals, and sacred texts could determine the fate of individuals and families alike. A carefully timed prophecy could legitimize a betrayal, condemn a rival, or redirect the king's suspicion toward a convenient scapegoat. The subtle manipulation of divine authority provided another layer of control within the palace, ensuring that fear of the gods reinforced the fear of men. Religious rituals, ostensibly designed to honor the divine, were frequently intertwined with political calculations, blurring the line between sacred duty and strategic cruelty. The psychological impact of this intertwining of divinity and danger was profound. Courtiers, servants, and even family members learned to navigate a world where human action and divine will were often inseparable in practice. A sudden illness, an untimely death, or a seemingly random accident could be interpreted as punishment from the gods, discouraging dissent and reinforcing obedience. The perception of divine oversight amplified paranoia, as individuals were never certain whether misfortune arose from human plotting or celestial judgment. This dual fear of men and gods heightened the stakes of every interaction, making survival within the palace both an intellectual and spiritual challenge. Queens and concubines were not immune to the influence of religion in their machinations. They frequently exploited religious belief to manipulate perception and consolidate power. Rituals could be orchestrated to demonstrate piety while simultaneously advancing a political agenda, reinforcing the illusion of divine favor. A queen might stage a seemingly spontaneous act of devotion to highlight the supposed moral failings of a rival, or invoke omens to discredit a potential threat. In this way, religion became both shield and sword, a tool of subtle coercion that shaped the palace's social and political landscape. The ability to navigate and manipulate the sacred sphere became as critical to survival as skill in political intrigue. The kings themselves often used religion to enforce loyalty and justify brutal actions. Punishments could be framed as divine retribution, and executions presented as fulfillment of sacred law. This blending of fear and faith ensured compliance while discouraging dissent. Advisors and courtiers who questioned decisions were not merely challenging authority, they risked appearing impious or unworthy in the eyes of the gods. In this environment, betrayal carried moral as well as physical consequences, amplifying the psychological tension within the palace. Religious ideology, carefully controlled, became an invisible tool of manipulation, reinforcing the omnipresent atmosphere of suspicion and anxiety. Spiritual rituals also intersected with surveillance and espionage. Priests could act as informants, reporting signs of ambition or disloyalty under the guise of interpreting omens. Festivals and ceremonial events were occasions to observe behavior, detect rivalries, and consolidate influence under the veneer of religious devotion. In this way, the palace's spiritual life was inseparable from its political life, creating a system in which psychology, religion, and power were inextricably linked. Even the most intimate acts of devotion could become a stage for observation, calculation, and subtle coercion, further complicating the delicate balance of trust and betrayal. The fear of divine retribution extended to the interpretation of dreams, visions, and portents. Kings and courtiers alike relied on the guidance of temple officials to understand signs from the gods, yet these interpretations could be manipulated. A convenient prophecy could be used to eliminate rivals, justify exiles, or conceal the true motives of palace intrigue. The blending of spiritual authority with political ambition ensured that betrayal was not only a human act but a seemingly inevitable response to divine mandate. The psychological impact of this intertwining created an environment where moral boundaries were fluid, and survival required an understanding of both earthly and spiritual dynamics. In addition to the overt manipulations of priests and queens, the mere suggestion of divine favor or disfavor could shape behavior. Courtiers carefully crafted their words and actions to appear pious, anticipating how the king might interpret their devotion or lack thereof. Missteps in ritual observance or public displays of morality could provoke suspicion, while skillful demonstrations of piety could elevate one's standing. In this way, spiritual practice became a calculated strategy, a subtle dance in which appearances, timing, and perception were as important as genuine belief. The palace, though physically magnificent, was a psychological and spiritual labyrinth in which fear, faith, and ambition converged. Ultimately, the psychological landscape of Babylon's palace was defined by a delicate balance between human intrigue and divine sanction. Betrayal was never purely personal or political. It was often framed within the context of morality, religion, and cosmic justice. The interplay between fear of man and fear of gods created a constant state of tension, where trust was provisional and every action had layered significance. Queens, concubines, priests, and courtiers navigated a world in which deception, manipulation, and subtle coercion were essential to survival. Within this framework, the palace was a theater of both earthly and spiritual calculation, where ambition, loyalty, and fear were intertwined in ways that were invisible to outsiders but profoundly consequential to those who lived within its walls. The result was a court where human psychology was tested to its limits. Survival required mastery of observation, persuasion, and strategic deception. Knowledge of human behavior, awareness of spiritual dynamics, and the ability to manipulate perception were as critical as any weapon or army. Betrayal became both a tool and a necessity, and the palace itself, though glittering and majestic, acted as a constant agent of pressure and vigilance. In Babylon, power was inseparable from fear, and the most potent influence often lay in the subtle orchestration of human psychology under the shadow of divine authority. Here, the mind was both battlefield and weapon, and those who understood this truth could shape the destiny of kings, dynasties, and empires alike. The culmination of Babylonian palace intrigue often arrived in the form of sudden, irrevocable violence, a stark reminder that survival was never guaranteed and that loyalty was fragile. The throne, glorious and coveted, cast long shadows over those who dwelled within the palace. Those who had maneuvered through years of subtle manipulation, espionage, and psychological games could still find themselves undone by a single miscalculation, a misplaced word, or a moment of misplaced trust. In Babylon, power was intoxicating but treacherous. The higher one climbed, the sharper the precipice beneath. The palace, resplendent in its ceremonial grandeur, concealed a theater of execution where mercy was often absent, and cruelty was disguised as justice or divine will. Executions, exiles, and public punishments were staged with deliberate theatricality, magnifying their psychological impact. The king understood that such displays reinforced authority while simultaneously instilling fear. Those who survived witnessed the fate of rivals and enemies, internalizing a grim lesson. The price of betrayal or perceived disloyalty could be instant and merciless. Courtiers observed not only the mechanics of these punishments but the subtle expressions of power, measuring how far the king's wrath could reach and calculating how to navigate their own positions. The spectacle of cruelty reinforced the delicate balance of obedience, manipulation, and self-preservation that defined palace life. Yet these acts of violence were rarely mere displays of power. They were carefully calculated messages. Every execution was a statement about hierarchy, obedience, and the consequences of ambition unchecked. Rivals could be eliminated under the guise of justice, rivals' allies neutralized, and fear propagated throughout the court without destabilizing the king's rule. In some cases, exile or imprisonment served as a more subtle form of punishment, removing threats while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. The manipulation of consequences, deciding who would live, who would die, and who would be cast aside, was as critical as the intrigues that led to them. The king's ability to orchestrate such outcomes reflected not only his power but the sophistication of the palace's psychological machinery. The psychological landscape of these acts was intricate. Courtiers and family members were acutely aware that each action carried multiple layers of meaning. A public execution communicated strength and divine sanction, a hidden poisoning signaled intelligence and subtlety, exile demonstrated both mercy and authority. The palace became a landscape in which every detail mattered, from the timing of a death to the choice of instruments used, each shaping perception and maintaining a careful equilibrium. This interplay of fear and strategy ensured that betrayal and its consequences were never straightforward, reinforcing the omnipresent tension that defined life in Babylon's royal court. Even the closest allies could fall victim to these dynamics. Ministers, generals, and trusted family members were always vulnerable, their loyalty continually scrutinized. Political expediency often outweighed personal relationships, as survival demanded constant reassessment of alliances and intentions. A trusted advisor might be eliminated not for failure but for being perceived as a potential threat, their talents or proximity to power rendering them dangerous. In this environment, relationships were transactional, and trust was always conditional. The palace was a crucible in which ambition, skill, and loyalty were tested relentlessly, and only the most perceptive could navigate its perils successfully. Queens and concubines, though sometimes protected by proximity to the king, were not immune from these deadly lessons. Their intricate manipulations, carefully cultivated influence, and subtle espionage could all be undone if a rival detected vulnerability or if the king's suspicion was aroused. Death and exile were tools as likely to be wielded against women as men, and the stakes were equally high. The palace demanded constant vigilance, psychological acuity, and the capacity to anticipate betrayal even from those one considered allies. In such an environment, mercy was rare, and the consequences of misjudgment immediate and absolute. The psychological intensity of these final acts of punishment extended beyond their immediate targets. Witnesses internalized lessons about the consequences of disloyalty, ambition, and miscalculation. Fear became a method of governance, reinforcing obedience and shaping the behavior of those who remained. Yet it was not fear alone. The specter of betrayal, combined with the understanding of subtle manipulation, ensured that every courtier learned to navigate a delicate web of intrigue. Survival required a mastery of perception, anticipation, and performance, transforming the palace into a constant stage of strategy where each individual played a role in an ongoing drama of life and death. Even the most cautious and intelligent courtiers were forced to reconcile with the unpredictability of human ambition. Alliances could shift, motivations could remain hidden, and fortunes could reverse in a single moment. The palace, though physically grand, was a psychological battlefield where vigilance, strategy, and subtlety were constantly tested. The tools of survival included not only wit and intelligence but the capacity to read the intentions of others, to manipulate perception, and to navigate the volatile interplay of ambition, fear, and loyalty. In Babylon, the price of misjudgment could be immediate and absolute, leaving no room for error. Ultimately, the spectacle of cruelty and the machinery of punishment revealed the stark reality of power within Babylon's palace. Authority was absolute, yet constantly challenged. Mercy was conditional, yet often absent. And betrayal, though feared, was inevitable. The careful orchestration of punishment, whether through death, exile, or subtle intimidation, ensured that the balance of power was maintained while reinforcing the psychological dominance of the king. The palace, a site of splendor and divine symbolism, was simultaneously a laboratory of human behavior, where fear, strategy, and cruelty intertwined to create an environment of perpetual tension and psychological mastery. This climate, forged through centuries of tradition, observation, and subtle manipulation, demonstrates the enduring complexity of Babylonian power structures. Life within the palace was not merely a contest of political skill. It was a continuous negotiation with mortality, loyalty, and perception. The stakes were total. Survival, influence, and even divine favor depended on one's ability to navigate this treacherous environment. The lessons learned from these acts of calculated cruelty endure as a profound reflection on the interplay of ambition, fear, and human psychology in the exercise of absolute power. In Babylon, mercy was fleeting, betrayal was constant, and the crown remained both a prize and a trap, forever reminding all who entered its sphere that authority demanded vigilance, cunning, and the cold embrace of ruthless strategy. As the walls of Babylon's palace rose in their grandeur, so too did the shadows of betrayal, intrigue, and ambition that defined its every hall. The stories of queens, concubines, princes, and ministers reveal a world where power demanded not only strategy but relentless vigilance. Within the gilded corridors, beauty and cruelty, devotion and fear, love and suspicion coexisted, each gesture and whispered word carrying potential life or death consequences. To walk these halls was to navigate a constant labyrinth of psychological traps, where every ally could become a rival, every loyalty was provisional, and even the most intimate relationships were subject to the shifting currents of ambition. The palace, magnificent to outsiders, was a crucible of human behavior, refining cunning, foresight, and the art of deception to their highest levels. Reflecting on these histories, it becomes clear that power, while intoxicating, exacted a profound cost. The very mechanisms that secured authority, manipulation, surveillance, psychological games, also bred paranoia, isolation, and moral ambiguity. Even those who mastered the palace's treacherous dynamics were imprisoned by their own intelligence, forever aware of the hidden threats that surrounded them. No comfort, no peace, no certainty of trust was possible. Babylon's palace, with its splendor and ceremonial brilliance, was also a prison of the mind, a place where brilliance and terror were inseparably intertwined, and survival required constant psychological vigilance. The higher one climbed in ambition, the sharper the cliff beneath became, and the more fragile every achievement seemed. The psychological lessons of Babylon resonate far beyond history. The intricacies of palace life reveal enduring truths about human ambition, jealousy, and strategy. Just as the courtiers had to anticipate the desires, fears, and duplicities of friends and rivals, people throughout history, and even today, navigate complex networks of influence and control. Fear and loyalty continue to shape decisions, alliances, and social dynamics. The palace becomes a lens through which we can examine the universal interplay of power and human behavior. Ambition is rarely straightforward, trust is always provisional, and survival depends on a nuanced understanding of perception, manipulation, and influence. Babylon's legacy demonstrates that the most effective power is often subtle, invisible, and psychological rather than merely physical. Yet amid this darkness, there is also awe. The ingenuity, intellect, and psychological sophistication displayed by those who survived, and sometimes thrived, within the palace are staggering. Queens who orchestrated subtle betrayals, concubines who influenced kings with calculated charm, princes who maneuvered through rivalries with foresight, and artisans and poisoners who operated unseen all demonstrate extraordinary adaptability. Their actions, while morally ambiguous or horrifying, reveal the capacity of humans to manipulate their environment and navigate extreme circumstances. The palace was not only a site of danger, it was a stage where human intellect, strategy, and resourcefulness were exercised daily, often with lethal consequences. The palace also demonstrates the delicate balance between mortality and legacy. Every betrayal, every calculated act of cruelty, left a ripple through the lives of those involved, shaping dynasties, influencing heirs, and altering the course of history. What might seem a private drama, a whispered plot, a poisoned meal, a subtle manipulation, was inseparably linked to the fate of an empire. Decisions made in these hidden spaces had consequences far beyond the palace walls, reminding us that the personal and the political, the intimate and the historical, were inseparably connected in Babylon. Each act of ambition or treachery contributed to a chain of events that defined not only individual fates but the very trajectory of civilization. Ultimately, the story of Babylon's palace is a story of contrasts, splendor and terror, loyalty and betrayal, divine sanction and human cunning. It forces reflection on the nature of power, the cost of ambition, and the psychological landscapes that govern human behavior. The palace challenges the assumption that authority is purely structural or legal. Instead, it illustrates that power is a living, psychological phenomenon, shaped by perception, fear, and strategy. The lessons of Babylon are both timeless and universal. Authority demands vigilance, ambition carries danger, and survival often requires intelligence, subtlety, and a willingness to operate within moral gray zones. Even as centuries pass, the Palace of Babylon remains a mirror reflecting the extremes of human behavior. It shows how fear can be cultivated to maintain control, how trust can be weaponized or exploited, and how ambition can drive individuals to extraordinary brilliance or devastating cruelty. The psychological sophistication demanded by palace life and the consequences of failure echo in the way humans manage influence, politics, and interpersonal dynamics across cultures and eras. Babylon's palace reminds us that the most potent power is not merely wielded with force but orchestrated with intellect, subtlety, and an understanding of the human mind. In the end, Babylon's palace stands as a testament to the enduring complexity of human nature. It teaches that trust is fragile, loyalty is conditional, and survival depends on mastery of perception and strategy. The crown, radiant and coveted, is inseparable from shadows of fear, intrigue, and betrayal. For those who inhabited the palace, every choice carried consequences, every gesture could conceal threat, and every moment was a delicate negotiation between ambition and mortality. The grandeur of the empire cannot be separated from the darkness that underpinned it, and the stories of those who lived and died within its walls continue to haunt, enlighten, and fascinate. Babylon's palace was not merely a home of kings and queens, it was the ultimate arena of human psychology, where brilliance and terror, faith and cruelty, love and betrayal collided in timeless and unforgettable ways.